To picture a righteous man, one needed only to look at Elias Thorne. His was a righteousness born from the unforgiving soil of Absolution, Wyoming, etched deep into the cracks of his calloused hands. His spine was as straight as the weathered fence posts, marking the vast expanse of land his father and his father's father had bled and sweat for. Elias Thorne's life was built on two unshakable pillars: the truth of the land and a moral code just as severe. But the truth, he was beginning to learn, had a way of shifting like dust under a man's boots, revealing fissures in foundations he once thought were solid rock. The definitive silence his wife, Sarah, had left behind 20 years ago was the most unstable ground of all. That gaping void, once a raw wound, had over time scarred over into the story he told himself, and more importantly, the story he told his daughter, Abigail. Sarah, he'd decreed with the quiet finality of a judge, was too fragile for a life in absolution, too weak for the demands of a man like him. It was a simple, brutal narrative that explained everything and absolved everyone, especially himself. In the vacuum of her absence, he raised Abigail in his own stark image, strong, unbending, and fiercely proud. That pride was the shield he held against the world's whispers and his own gnawing doubts. It was also the high, cold walls of his cage. Now, as he pulled on the stiff dress boots he reserved only for funerals and town meetings, the leather groaning in protest, Abigail appeared in the doorway of his bedroom. She stood with her arms crossed, a gesture she'd unconsciously learned from him, her posture a youthful mirror of his own rigid stance. "You don't have to go, Dad," she said, her voice even but carrying a distinct edge of challenge. "It's just a spectacle. The whole town pretending we're something we're not." Elias merely grunted, his large hands fumbling for a moment as he adjusted the suffocating collar of his shirt. He refused to meet her gaze in the mirror. "It's Founder's Day," he stated, his voice low and gravelly, a sound like stones rolling downhill. "A thorn has always gone." It was about duty. It was about the order of things, the unchanging traditions that held their fragile world together against the encroaching chaos. Or so he told himself, the well-worn justification feeling thinner than ever. The foundations of absolution are built on secrets. Subscribe to uncover the truth buried in the Thorne family legacy and see how one man's pride leads to his downfall. Don't miss a single chapter. The air in the town hall was a suffocating blend of cloying perfume and simmering hypocrisy, so thick I felt it coat my lungs with every breath. Up on the stage, trapped in the unforgiving glare of buzzing fluorescent lights, stood Lena. She was new to our tight-lipped town, a blank page everyone was eager to scribble their ugliest assumptions on. Beside her, preening under the attention, was Marcus Blackwood. With a family that owned half the county, he could afford to play benefactor, and tonight he was hosting his special brand of charity auction. The prize wasn't some signed memorabilia or a weekend getaway. It was Lena's time, her company, a dance, a dinner. It was a public flogging dressed up as a fundraiser, and the whole town had come to watch, their polite smiles barely concealing the collective hunger for drama. I focused on Lena, on the barely perceptible tremor in her hands, on the defiant tilt of her chin as she stared out over the crowd. She wasn't begging for sympathy, she was bracing for impact. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it shattered into a cold, hard anger. Pity is a useless emotion, a balm for the spectator, not the sufferer. This was rage. This wasn't about helping a neighbor. This was a pack of coyotes closing in, salivating at the thrill of the chase. I could see them all. Mrs. Gable from the bakery, her lips pursed in pious judgment. Sheriff Miller, pretending to be there for security, but enjoying the show as much as anyone. "Let's start the bidding at 50 for a dance." Marcus's voice boomed, slick with false bonhomie. A man in the third row, a farmer I knew to be deep in debt to the Blackwood Bank, immediately shouted, "75! Laughter rippled through the hall. "I'll pay 100 for a dinner," called another voice, "so long as she tells me where she really came from." The jeer hung in the air, a fresh jab that made Lena flinch just for a second. That was enough. I couldn't swallow another moment of it. The sound of my chair scraping against the worn floorboards was like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. Every head turned. I pushed myself to my feet and, without a word, started the long walk toward the double doors at the back. I didn't look back, but I felt them. I felt every single pair of eyes on my back, a palpable weight of curiosity and condemnation, colder and more crushing than a midwinter snowstorm. That one act of protest was the first domino to fall. Thorne had braced himself for the consequences, fully expecting to become an outcast, a fate that seemed confirmed by the immediate shunning from Blackwood and his cronies. He spent a long night staring at the ceiling, the silence amplifying the quiet rejection he anticipated from a town where breaking ranks was a grave sin. But the dawn brought not isolation, but an unexpected sight. A line of dusty pickup trucks materializing at the edge of his property. They were faces he barely knew. Old Man Hemlock from the Shoshone Reservation, the perpetually struggling Jensen brothers from the next valley over. Families to whom he had only ever offered a passing nod. Their presence was a quiet one, their support conveyed through simple gestures rather than grand speeches. Hemlock approached, handing Thorne a thermos of coffee. His voice, like gravel, cut through the morning air. "Heard what you did, Thorne," he said. "It was the right thing." Dowd, what they called solidarity, felt to Thorne like an immense debt he had no idea how to repay. The weight of their support was compounded by a disquieting truth he kept to himself. His stand had not really been for Lena. It was an act born of his own rigid sense of order, a personal righteousness that was now, in the face of this unexpected alliance, about to be tested to its very core. A few days after the performance that had etched her image into his mind, he saw Lena again in town. Standing near the general store, she was a stark contrast to the defiant figure who had commanded the stage. In the harsh afternoon light, stripped of the dim, forgiving glow of the bar, she seemed diminished, her shoulders curved inwards as if to shield herself from the world's casual scrutiny. The fire he had witnessed in her eyes was banked to a low, weary ember. It was then that the peculiar weight of responsibility settled upon him again, not as a choice, but as an undeniable duty he could not shirk, a feeling as old and deep as the soil of his own farm. He approached her, his words feeling clumsy as he offered her the work, the unglamorous, back-breaking tasks of mucking out stalls and mending fences. More than just a job, he offered a refuge, the old forgotten cabin down by the creek. He had expected hesitation, perhaps suspicion, but saw only a flicker of exhausted relief pass over her face before she quietly accepted. When her worn-out sedan, groaning and sputtering, finally pulled up the long gravel drive a day later, Abigail was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, a storm brewing in her young face. Her disapproval was immediate and sharp, a palpable force between them. "She's a stranger, Dad," Abigail insisted, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and teenage anger. "You can't just bring her here. People in this town will talk, Blackwood will find out, and he'll come after you." The name hung in the air, a prophecy of trouble he was choosing to ignore. He shut down the argument, telling her it was settled with a hardness in his tone that he instantly regretted, a new wall rising between him and his daughter. But the decision was made, a stone dropped into the quiet pool of their lives. Lena, however, moved through the farm's rugged spaces with a grace that defied her fragile appearance. She possessed a different kind of strength, one he didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't in the brute force of lifting hay bales or hammering posts, but in a quieter, more profound connection to the life that pulsed around them. He watched astonished as she calmed a spooked mare, a notoriously difficult horse. with just a low murmur and a steady, gentle hand on its trembling neck. She turned her attention to the patch of earth by the cabin, a garden he had long given up on, where the soil was hard and unforgiving. With patient hands, she coaxed tiny green seedlings to life, tending to them with a devotion that felt almost sacred. It was in these quiet moments, watching her work, that the past began to bleed into the present. There was a stillness in her movements, a gentle focus in the way her hands moved through the dirt, that was a haunting echo of Sarah. He would see Lena's silhouette against the setting sun, and for a heart-stopping moment, the image would blur with a memory buried deep. It wasn't love or even desire, but a far more complex feeling, a resonance that vibrated through the years of his grief. Her presence pricked at the scar tissue over his heart, unearthing a tenderness and sorrow he thought he had forgotten how to feel. Lena was a quiet disturbance, an echo in the soil, threatening to bring everything he had lost back to the surface. Blackwood's retaliation wasn't overt. He didn't come after Elias with a shotgun. His style was more insidious, like a slow-acting poison. The assault began subtly, with a deceptively friendly call from the water commissioner expressing just some concerns about Elias's draw from the creek. Nothing to worry about, he was assured. Soon after, a surveyor appeared, hired by Blackwood to just confirm a property line that had been shared between their families for a century. The obstacles became a constant drain, each one small enough to be plausibly deniable, yet cumulatively costing Elias precious time and money. Then the attack shifted to his reputation. Whispers started at the feed store and spread to the diner, suggesting his credit was failing and that he was struggling more than he let on. The pressure soon extended to the farmers who supported him. Their own lines of credit were suddenly put under review. Elias understood then that the fight was no longer about one woman's dignity. It had become a battle for the soul of their entire community. Com o passar do tempo, o distanciamento de Abigail tornava-se mais evidente, o seu rosto uma máscara de constante desilusão. Cada vez que o via a conversar com Lena, ou notava as pequenas melhorias que a mulher trazia à quinta, um vaso de flores silvestres no alpendre da cabana, um portão que finalmente deixara de ranger, uma nova camada de gelo formava-se entre pai e filha. A tensão acumulada finalmente quebrou numa noite, quando ela o encurralou no celeiro. "Por que é que estás a fazer isto?", exigiu com a voz tensa, carregada de uma fúria contida. "Estás a arriscar tudo o que a nossa família construiu, e tudo por causa dela." Ele tentou argumentar, fazer com que ela compreendesse a questão de princípio por detrás das suas ações. "É a coisa certa a fazer, Abby. Não se pode simplesmente deixar que um homem como Blackwood intimide as pessoas." A sua justificação, contudo, não a moveu. Abigail limitou-se a abanar a cabeça, um sorriso amargo e desdenhoso a desenhar-se nos seus lábios. "É isso que dizes a ti mesmo para dormires à noite? Que és uma espécie de herói? Não, tu estás apenas a ser teimoso. Sempre foste." As palavras dela atingiram-no como farpas, cravando-se num ponto demasiado familiar e sensível. Um pavor gélido começou a insinuar-se nas fundações da sua certeza, abalando a convicção que o tinha guiado até aquele momento. A fragile truce had settled over the ranch, a fleeting and deceptive spring amid the Cold War that had defined their lives. In the dim light of the barn, one of the man's oldest cows was in the throes of a difficult birth, and he had resigned himself to the inevitable loss of the calf. His resolve had crumbled. He was ready to end the poor creature's suffering before it had truly begun. A grim task, he felt, was his alone. But then Lena appeared, moving with the quiet grace of a mouse slipping through the shadows. Without a word to him, she went to the struggling mother, her voice a low and constant murmur as she stroked the animal's neck. For an entire hour she remained, working with a profound patience he had never been able to muster. Against all odds, her gentle persistence succeeded. She managed to turn the calf, and though it emerged small and weak, it drew its first breath. The shared victory lingered into the evening, thawing the frost between them. The rancher found himself breaking a years-long silence, the words spilling out as he recounted the story of his own first delivery, the memory of his father standing over his shoulder as vivid as if it were yesterday. It was the most he had shared of his past with anyone in a long, long time. But the moment was ephemeral. From the porch, Abigail's silhouette stood stark against the dying light, a silent observer whose presence was enough to extinguish the fragile warmth he had felt, plunging him back into the familiar chill. The fragile peace was not destined to last. The consequences of the dammed-up creek rippled outwards, striking the Jensen brothers' livelihood. With their water supply diminished, they were forced to sell half their herd. Soon after, they appeared at his door, hats held humbly in their hands, to deliver the news that they could no longer stand with him. For the protagonist, this was no mere betrayal. It was a surrender, an admission of defeat that cut deeper than any act of malice. That night the weather mirrored the turmoil brewing within the house. The wind howled like a mournful Greek chorus, rattling the window panes as if demanding a reckoning. Inside, the long simmering storm between him and his daughter Abigail finally erupted. "This is your fault," she accused, her voice raw with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Your pride, you had to make your stand, and now the Jensens are ruined because of you." Stung by the accusation, he yelled back, his defense built on vague notions of honor and the importance of not backing down. But his words were a fortress of sand against the tide of her resentment. It was then that Abigail delivered the words that would knock the very foundation from under his feet. "Don't talk to me about honor," she stated, her voice dropping to a devastating calm. "She didn't abandon you, Dad. You drove her away. I've been talking to Mom for years." The confession hung in the air, a truth so profound it silenced the storm both inside and out, leaving him utterly shattered. The world seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, every sound ceased. The sighing of the wind, the familiar rattle of the window panes, even the frantic rhythm of his own heart. A void opened where the noise of his life used to be. The revelation crashed over him, dismantling 2 decades of carefully constructed reality. His wife was not a ghost, not a memory lost to the ether. She was alive, somewhere else. And Abigail, his daughter, his own flesh and blood, had carried the weight of this secret all along. The story he had told himself for 20 years, a tale of betrayal and abandonment, crumbled into dust. The narrative in which he was the wronged party, the forsaken husband, was a lie. He was not the victim. He was the cause. The abandonment was a consequence of his own actions. He opened his mouth, a desperate need to ask, to understand, clawing at his throat. Where? Why? The questions were there, screaming in his mind, but they died before they could become sound, his vocal cords paralyzed. Abigail's gaze held no trace of triumph, only a profound, weary pain that seemed to age her before his very eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it struck him with the force of a physical blow. "She was afraid of you." With those 5 words, she sealed his verdict and walked out the door, leaving him utterly alone in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the crushing weight of his own failures. The quiet forced him to confront the reflection in an emotional mirror he had long avoided. In its unforgiving surface, he saw his own stubborn pride staring back, a toxic legacy he now recognized not only in his daughter's pained expression, but also in the silent desperation he had refused for so long to see in his wife. He was the ghost in his own story, haunting the lives he was meant to cherish. The day that followed was shrouded in a dense, suffocating fog, a haze that was not of the weather, but of the soul. Thorn moved through it like a sleepwalker, the familiar rooms of his home rendered strange and hollow. Abigail's absence was a palpable void. She had left before dawn, a brief, sterile note on the kitchen table announcing she was staying with a friend in town, the words a testament to the chasm that had opened between them. Lena, ever perceptive, navigated the oppressive silence with a quiet caution. She kept her distance, her movements tentative, her eyes, when they chanced to meet his, filled with a sorrowful understanding that offered no comfort, only confirmation of the disaster. She sensed the shift in the very air of the house, the prelude to a storm that had already broken within him. Unable to bear the suffocating stillness indoors, he sought refuge in the fields, but found none. He walked for hours, the rich earth that had sustained his family for generations, feeling alien and hostile under his boots for the first time in his life. The land, once his staunchest ally and a source of profound identity, now seemed to reject him. Every rustle of leaves in the ancient oaks sounded like a whisper of judgment, every familiar contour of the rolling hills a monument to his failure. He ran a hand over the rough, weathered wood of a fence post his grandfather had driven into the ground, searching for a connection, a sense of belonging, but felt only cold, splintered wood. The legacy he carried was a weight, not a foundation, and it was cracking beneath his feet. The end, when it came, did not arrive with the roar of a storm or the heat of a final confrontation. It announced itself with the mundane, quiet crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, a sound that sliced through the afternoon's heavy stillness with surgical precision. Thorne froze mid-stride in the west pasture, a cold knot of certainty tightening in his gut. A nondescript sedan, clean and official, had pulled up to the house. A courier from the bank, a young man with an impassive face, emerged, holding a thick manila envelope. This was it, Blackwood's final checkmating move. He walked back toward the house, each step a journey of 1,000 miles. The courier offered no pleasantries, only a clipboard and a pen. "Signature required," he stated, his voice flat. Thorne signed his name, the loops and lines of his own signature looking like a stranger's script. The exchange was sterile, transactional, a chillingly impersonal delivery of utter devastation. He took the envelope, its weight disproportionate to its size, and watched the car retreat down the lane, leaving a small cloud of dust to settle in its wake. Inside, the silence of the house pressed in on him. With trembling hands, he tore open the envelope. The document inside was cold and crisp, a foreclosure notice. His eyes scanned the dense, legalistic text, the words blurring and sharpening. Then he saw them, the names. A debt taken out by Sarah's father, co-signed by his own decades ago. A ghost from a past he never knew, a promise made between two men long since turned to dust. A debt that the Blackwood family, with chilling patience and predatory foresight, had acquired and held in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was a masterstroke of cold-blooded revenge, a weapon forged in the past to annihilate his future. He read it again, desperately searching for a flaw, a loophole, an error that could undo the pronouncement. There was none. It was legal, airtight, and undeniable. The paper fell from his numb fingers onto the floor. He looked out the window at the land stretching to the horizon, the setting sun casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The farm, the house, the barns, the fields, the entire Thorne legacy, a living history built with the sweat and sacrifice of generations, was gone. It had not been lost in a dramatic battle, but signed away with the quiet scratch of a pen, erased by the weight of an old, forgotten debt. He stood on the creaking wooden boards of the porch, the official eviction papers, a flimsy, damning testament, trembling in his hand. His gaze drifted, unfocused, over the vast expanse of land that stretched out before him, a familiar panorama that was now alien territory, no longer his. Every tree, every rolling hill was a monument to his failure. The dry afternoon air felt heavy, charged with the finality of his loss. Just then, the sound of tires on the gravel drive cut through the heavy silence. Abigail's old sedan pulled to a stop. She stepped out, the car door closing with a soft thud that echoed in the stillness. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, went first to the paper clutched in his hand and then lifted to his face, searching for something. Remorse, perhaps, or a sign that he understood the gravity of what he had done. But what she saw was something far more pathetic. The shell of a man, his pride the architect of their shared ruin. She saw the man who had gambled away their heritage, their security, their future, all for the sake of being right. Abigail offered no words of comfort or condemnation. The silence that stretched between them was more potent than any shouted accusation. It was a silence filled with years of unspoken warnings and her quiet disappointment. With a resolve that seemed to age her beyond her years, she turned her back on him and walked past, disappearing through the familiar doorway to pack a bag. Her movements were brisk, efficient, a clear signal that she was done with this place, done with his failures. He remained on the porch, rooted to the spot by the crushing weight of his realization. He hadn't just lost a piece of property, he had forfeited his entire legacy. He had lost the respect of his only daughter, a chasm now opened between them that felt too wide to ever cross. The story of his life, a narrative he had once controlled with such self-assurance, had dissolved into this single, shameful chapter. This, right here, was the moment of his breakthrough. Standing amidst the wreckage he himself had built, he saw the truth with a brutal, piercing clarity. All his convictions, his unbending principles, had amounted to nothing more than a hollow, self-serving righteousness. The foundation of his identity had been pulverized, leaving him utterly and completely broken. That night, long after the sun had set and the house had been plunged into a deep, unfamiliar darkness, he wandered its rooms like a lost soul. He moved in a daze, his fingertips tracing the textures of his life. The cool, painted surface of the walls, the worn, smooth wood of a dining chair, the familiar outline of a dusty picture frame. He was a ghost in his own memories, a spectral presence in a home that was already shedding its identity as his. With every step, he was acutely aware that he was simply a trespasser in what was about to become someone else's domain, a silent witness to the final, fading moments of his own existence. In the hollow silence of that last night in the house, an emptiness that seemed to amplify every small sound, his hand brushed against something forgotten in the depths of the closet. He was packing the few things that were truly his, the remnants of a life about to be left behind, when he felt the rough texture of cardboard. It was an old, dust-covered box, a relic he knew instantly. A jolt went through him, as if he had touched a live wire. Inside were Sarah's things, items he had packed away in the raw, chaotic week after she had left, unable to bear the sight of them, yet incapable of letting them go. His heart began a frantic, painful hammering against his ribs, a rhythm he remembered all too well. There, resting atop a stack of books whose titles he no longer recalled, was a single sealed envelope. His name was written across the front in her familiar, elegant script, a ghost from a past he had tried to bury. It was the letter, the one that had arrived a week after her disappearance. Blinded by a wounded pride so sharp it felt like a physical injury, he had thrown it into this box without a second thought, refusing to grant her the final word. He had let it sit there, entombed in the dark, a silent testament to his stubbornness for 20 years. A tremor ran through Elias's hands as he carefully slid a finger under the dry, brittle flap of the envelope. The aged paper crackled in the heavy silence of the room. He unfolded the single page, its creases holding years of secrets, and sank onto the dusty floorboards. The only light was the cold, silver glow of the moon slanting through the grimy window, casting long shadows that danced around him like ghosts of the past. His eyes traced the elegant, faded script, and then it came. The devastating revelation, a truth so profound it felt like the floor had fallen away beneath him. It was a twist that shattered his reality, recontextualizing every memory, every argument, every cold silence that had defined his life since she had gone. Sarah hadn't left because she was weak. She hadn't left because she didn't love him. The ink on the page, faint as a whisper, screamed a truth he had been too blind to see. She had left to save him. The letter confessed a secret she had carried like a lead weight in her soul. A gambling debt her father had foolishly racked up with Marcus Blackwood's ruthless father. After her own father's death, the debt, with all its suffocating interest, had fallen to her. Faced with an impossible choice, she had made an irreversible decision, a terrible pact. She would disappear, vanish from his life without a trace, and in exchange, the Blackwoods would forget the debt. She had done it to protect the farm, their home. She had done it to protect him. The words swam before his eyes, each one a fresh wound. "I couldn't tell you, Elias," she had written, her vulnerability bleeding through the faded ink. "I was terrified of the judgment I saw in your eyes every day. I couldn't bear to see you look at me with that cold disappointment. It was easier to let you think I was weak than to show you I was broken." The letter slipped from his numb fingers. Broken. She had been broken, and he, in his pride and hurt, had only seen weakness. He had cultivated his resentment, nursed his anger, letting it fester into a cold, hard stone in his chest. He had judged her with the very cold disappointment she had feared, and that realization now struck him with the force of a physical blow. The years he had spent believing a lie she had constructed out of love and desperation, stretched before him as a barren wasteland of his own making. The moonlight illuminated the tear that finally traced a path through the dust on his cheek. It wasn't just the ink that had faded. It was the truth he had refused to see. The letter slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. The paper, once a vessel of anticipated victory, now felt like ash against the sudden coldness of his skin. A profound, chilling clarity washed over him, extinguishing the fire of vengeance that had burned for so long. The real antagonist, the architect of so much pain, had never been her, or even the monstrous figure of Blackwood. The true enemy had been staring back at him from his own reflection all along. It was his own distorted perception, a cold and unforgiving righteousness that had masqueraded as justice, that had created the invisible wound. This rigid, self-made virtue had carved a chasm between them, denying her the one thing she had so desperately needed, his grace. The realization was not a sudden strike of lightning, but a slow, dawning horror that settled deep in his bones, making him feel hollow. In that stark, silent moment, he understood he stood at a crossroads. The two divergent futures laid bare before him. He now held the truth, a weapon potent enough to destroy the Blackwood family and their entire legacy of preying on the weak. He could have his revenge. He could reclaim his land, his name, everything that had been stolen from him. The path of retribution was clear, and it promised a bitter, satisfying triumph, or he could choose the harder path. His thoughts drifted to Old Man Hemlock, to the quiet wisdom in his weathered face. He thought of the Jensen brothers, of the tribes that had gathered around a fire, not for a perfect man, but for one who had taken a small, flawed step toward compassion. They had seen his humanity beneath his mistakes. It was this model of leadership, flawed but striving, that he now clung to. He found Abigail in her room, a half-packed suitcase open on the bed, a stark symbol of the fractures he had caused. He didn't show her the letter. The truth was no longer a weapon to be used against others, no longer a tool for retribution. It was a private burden, a quiet compass now pointing him toward a different horizon. He stood in her doorway, a silhouette against the fading afternoon light, the weight of 2 decades of silence pressing down on him. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and years of hardened resentment. Finally, he found the strength to break the stillness, uttering the hardest words of his life. "I was wrong, Abby," he confessed, the statement little more than a whisper. His voice, once an instrument of command and authority, was now fragile, stripped of its power. About everything. About your mother. He watched her face for any sign of change, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The request that followed sounded like a monumental surrender. "I need to talk to her. Can you tell me how to find her?" Abby stared at him. Her eyes, which for so long had only reflected her own stubborn pride, now scrutinized his face with a disconcerting intensity. For a long, tense moment, their relationship remained at an impasse. Then, for the first time in years, the rigid mask of disappointment she had always worn towards him began to break down. A glimmer of something new, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a nascent understanding, softened her features. It was an expression he couldn't name, but it was enough. With a slow, deliberate nod that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of his appeal, she turned, wrote a number on a small piece of paper and held it out to him. As his fingers closed around the fragile paper, a profound clarity came over him, dislodging the anger that had been his companion for so long. He finally understood the true nature of what he was looking for. Forgiveness was not a gift to be granted to the transgressor, a pardon for his choices. It was a liberation, a key to unlocking the cage he had built around his own heart. In that silent epiphany, he recognized that the climax of his life would not be a dramatic confrontation or a victory in a battle for land. It would be this, a silent, terrifying, and deeply personal journey towards an apology 20 years too late. His catharsis would not be born of revenge or retribution. It would come from the humility of meeting Sarah, standing before the woman he had so deeply and deliberately misunderstood, and looking into her eyes. This was his chance to dismantle the legacy of bitterness he had built, stone by stone, and in its place leave a new inheritance, not one of land and fences, but a lasting legacy of forgiveness.